All right, shifting focus now to our other big story. We begin with a story that has moved far beyond a pay hike protest in Noida. We shift gears away to the core issue behind the protest, since that conversation just got lost somewhere between violence and crackdown. Factory workers, remember, have been saying this is actually about whether their income keeps up with the cost of living, whether their working hours are fair, and whether there is any real sense of job security on the ground. Many workers even flagged that when wages increase, inflation quickly cancels out the benefit, leaving little real improvement in monthly earnings. In response to the unrest, remember, Uttar Pradesh government stepped in with a revision of minimum wages by 21% for industrial workers. The increase has been implemented across categories and applied retrospectively in an attempt to ease tensions in the region. Officials say the idea was to restore immediate stability and address worker concerns quickly. But on the ground, workers feel the revision still doesn't fully match rising costs of living. Let's also talk about manufacturers and their dilemma. What happened in Noida is also in a way linked to uncertainty amid the West Asia war. Not entirely, but partially. Industry is under strain, remember. Small and medium manufacturers are dealing with rising input costs, global supply disruptions, fuel price volatility, all linked to tensions in West Asia. So for MSMEs, already operating on tight margins, sudden labor disruptions and wage pressures add another layer of uncertainty. But that said, this wage hike demand was prevalent much before the conflict began. What is needed now is a structured approach, not just reactive decisions. In the short term, remember, stronger grievance redressal systems could help resolve issues before they escalate into protests. Regular wage reviews linked to inflation may also prevent sudden spikes in unrest. And most importantly, there needs to be continuous communication between workers, the management and the state. So that's the concern that needs to be addressed not just in the interim but in the long term as well. And this one concern essentially led to protests on the streets. Now, unfortunately, it turned violent. There were conspirators behind it who amplified the scale of the protest, which gave it a violent turn. So we'll try and steer away from that conversation and really focus on these core issues. If the protests indeed remain peaceful, what is it that these factory workers were looking at? Long term as well, remember, a lot more needs to be done. So let's bring in our guest this morning. Vineet Toshtiwal, president of security firm SIS Limited, will take this conversation forward. Good morning, Vineet. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Breakfast Club. Vineet, like I said, somehow because of the scale of the protests, the ugly turn it took, now an alleged conspiracy, a crackdown is taking place, all that has shifted focus entirely away from the core demands which were being staged here, which were being flagged here, which were being raised here. So Vineet, very quickly, let's break down those 3-4 demands first up. What is it that these factory workers essentially were asking for? And they say this is not just limited to the last 2-3 months, which means not right after the conflict began. The last 6 months, different parts of the country, we've seen different factory workers raise these demands and also to some extent stage protests over the same.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for hosting me on the show. Look, as principal, I will not comment on the specific issue. I'll stick to the broad policy level, framework, right? So what we are seeing is a bit of an unrest, definitely. And this is very normal for an economy which is transitioning primarily from a consumption and services-led economy to a manufacturing-led economy. That's our aspiration. And the government and the Prime Minister is very, very clear. We want to increase the share of manufacturing. So as the economy transitions to a manufacturing-led economy, the doctrinal shift that has to come into the economy is to move from a minimum wage model to a fair wage model, which is from a subsistence level to a dignified level. The labor is not, just another like a production factor. It's basically they are looking for dignified living. They are aspirational, and labor is like capital is mobile. Even labor is mobile. Everybody is aware. So everybody needs to have a competitive framework to attract labor and not just offer minimum, but offer dignified living.
Okay, Vineet,
the wages have to reflect.
But realistically, how do you do that? So up until now, the model which is followed is the minimum wages model, correct? So that has two components. One is basic wage and one is cost of living. The entire conversation is purely based, and at least to a large extent based around the minimum wage level. Now, technically, that minimum wage is supposed to be revised every 5 years. And we're
Mhm.
just talking about the factories or industries that fall under the state government. We're not talking about the ones that fall under the central government. There, of course, the wages are also slightly on the upper side. We've not seen so many complaints so far coming from the industry workers. But keeping up with those that fall under the state government, the revision is supposed to take place every 5 years. In the case of Uttar Pradesh, the last time it was revised was 2012. In the case of Haryana, wherein the industry has revised it to more than 30% this time, that also has taken place after a decade. So there is a fundamental flaw in just following the basic rules here.
You're right. So, as I said, when we look at a transition to a manufacturing-led economy, we have to understand both from the employer's perspective and from the
Yeah,
employee's perspective
yeah.
also. So, and investors all over the world, if we talk of China plus one, what they're looking for is predictability, right? And in terms of cost, in terms of sustainability, and everything. So, we have to move from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. What
Correct.
we have to do is we have to have a 5-year timetable clearly, as it happens in many Western economies. Like, for instance, SIS is the largest security provider company in Australia. We have a clear 5-year table of wages, right, which is there. It offers predictability to employers also. It offers predictability to employees. So the revision is based on a calendar, and it is linked to a defined inflation-linked formula, so that the ambiguity and is taken out completely out of the process, and
Correct.
everybody can follow a predictable cost.
This is what is supposed to happen. This is how it's supposed to be done. And that's where the fundamental flaw lies. And that's why we're focusing on how so much more needs to be done in the short term, in the long term. But there are a couple of other demands which were raised by these factory workers too, Vineet. If you could quickly come in on that and tell us a little bit about what the sentiment really on ground is, because again, that's not being spoken of as much. The other aspect to the story is confusion about labor codes. So there is one component which is code on wages. Now, again, there is a little bit of a confusion there, so it's important that we clear out that confusion. The demand being raised by some of these laborers was that the minimum wages be close to 20,000. Now, I think they're confusing it somewhere. These factories fall or industries fall under the state government. This 20,000 applies to only the type A category, and that too for industries that fall under the central government. What is leading to this confusion? So the companies need to be in a situation today that they can transparently and clearly communicate this to their workers. That's why there is so much confusion. One WhatsApp message, oh, you're supposed to be given 20,000, but look, you're being given 11,000. That's what leads to this kind of confusion.
You're right. So again, without commenting on the very specifics of the case, let me take it, address it at the policy level. See, this whole disparity that exists between the central wages and the
Yeah.
state wages. I think it's time now that it should go, right? Labor is mobile, and you can't have a factory right next door to a bank where the bank guard or the worker in the bank is getting paid as per the central minimum wage, and the right next door factory he's getting paid as per the state wages, which are
Yeah.
having a huge disparity. So I think as part of these labor codes, what we are seeing also is that government is trying to bring in a national floor minimum wage, right? Once that concept is rolled out, there is going to be a floor level wage. Of course, you can pay above that, but you can't pay below that, right? So it will remove disparity, hopefully to a large extent across the nation. Right now, the wages on the eastern part of the country is much lesser than the south and the western part, right? While the inflation is running amok and practically cost of living is higher, is rising everywhere. So we need to have a standardized national floor level wage, so that and a defined timetable, as I said, in terms of wage revisions
Vineet,
linked to inflation.
yeah, the problem is actually or has unfolded at a very micro level. If you look at the sequence of events, at least the last 2 months, ever since the West Asia conflict began, small little developments like, your LPG cylinders not being easily accessible, only owing to the fact that a lot of people started panic buying, which is what the government kept warning against. Now, who felt the first big shock because of that? It is these people who wanted their LPG cylinders but were not being able to get access to it because others were panic buying and hoarding. And then they had to pay more for the LPG cylinder because they would also have to buy in black. Now, that is one micro level problem which led to this. When you're going to have to pay double or triple the price for your everyday cooking, you're going to demand more minimum wages. So one of the many problems I think also began at that level. Correct me if I'm wrong and tell me how, that's pinching a common factory worker. That is one of the biggest contributors of what we see daily in our lives, in our urban setup, and they're currently feeling the pinch because of so many external factors.
Right. So again, very specific trigger exists here in terms of LPG prices because
And it's a trigger for the manufacturers as well. If they're not going
everybody,
to be able to,
and it is because of the war. Hopefully, it's a temporary situation. It gets resolved. But I think the learnings from this incident is such triggers will keep coming every now and then, right? And the cost of living is rising. It needs to be linked to a transparent formula in terms of cost of living index, and recognizing that it's an aspirational living now. It's not just roti kapda makan subsistence level living, right? Take for instance education, take for instance health, take for instance entertainment. All these are essential costs, a must, right? So we have to
So
take
how
into
difficult
account.
does it become for, if we just flip the story and focus on the confusion in the manufacturing circuit, how difficult does it become for manufacturers to pay salaries on time? Because delayed payments was another concern. Being paid for overtime work was another concern. So tell us a little bit about the other side of the spectrum too.
Yes, so if you see the new labor codes, clearly the government has defined the policy. I think they are yet to be notified, but I think the policy framework is in the public. The new labor code mandates the employers, which is a service provider like an SIS or equivalent, and the principal employer, both are now joint and severally termed as employer. The employer is responsible to ensure that the wages are paid by the 7th of the month, right? It's a legal statutory obligation onto the employer, right? So this, hopefully the implementation of this labor code will solve this problem, because it will be legally binding on both the service provider and the principal employer to ensure that the wages are paid in time, right?
The telling thing, Vineet, and the unfortunate part really in all this, of course, the other really unfortunate part is the fact that some people could take undue advantage of the sentiment of these factory workers. That there was a larger conspiracy at play, that the protests turned violent. But the other aspect to the story is that these protests became visible only when they broke the regular rhythm of the city life. And we're all really dependent on the contributions made by each of these workers. So it's time that these concerns are actually addressed. Again, like I said, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well. But thank you so much for joining us this morning and taking us through the different aspects that are important to the demands being raised by the factory workers. There's another layer to the story.